Makes sense. All right, so it's been suggested that we stop the stream because it seems like it's well on our end. Stop the stream and restart. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to stop this thing, and Zoom is going to continue to record our session. And then we're going to restart and see if that works. And if it doesn't, we're just going to plow ahead, and we'll rely on uploading the Zoom in a little bit. So I'll see you back in just a second. See if this will work. As soon as Brian jumps in, we'll go back and start back with our discussion on the gospel and politics. Love the comments about my beard. Hopefully this is gonna work better than our other one. All right, here we go. Brian, you're getting a lot of love on Instagram right now.
And we're back.
And we're back. Can you hear my audio okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
I heart you too, Lucas.
It's so funny that Lucas is our intern who has no social media accounts, and so he has to use his fiance's account. All right, here we go. Still, go ahead in your comments. You can go ahead and put some questions for Brian, and we'll go ahead and update those. We want to ask the second question is this: how active should Christians be in the public square? And I may add a follow-up is, what public square do you think is best for us to be active in?
Yeah, that's a really good question. What do we mean by the public square? Do we mean Twitter? Do we mean social media? I hope not. One, it's not an accurate representation of reality. It's interesting to read the interviews with people after the last election. Everyone thought their candidate was going to win because everyone they saw online was agreeing with them. Well, these companies are creating a nice little cocoon for us so we feel comfortable. So it shouldn't surprise us. So if by the public square you mean real conversations with real people, not behind a keyboard, then yes, I think we should be active there, but establishing some principles. So for instance, we first need to agree that politics in this world is not ultimate, that fundamentally we as Christians are members of a government, of a kingdom, and it's not the one of this world. And so nothing in this world is ultimate to me in that way. It's not worth, trying to gain the world and losing my soul in that way. But I think the question we also need to ask is the reverse of that. Am I willing to risk losing some of the world to keep my soul? There are some issues for people that we just hold on to so tightly politically. We alienate the people around us. We lose the joy of the Lord in our life. We forget that God is ultimately working all things for our good as Christians and for his kingdom, but it might take more than 250 characters, 4 years, or our lifetimes. So having an eternal view, I think, is very important on politics. But all that said, if we understand we're fundamentally citizens of another kingdom and this is not our home, we're visitors here, then that's freeing, first off. But secondly, I can be very comfortable not being at home in any party. And it probably shouldn't surprise us that if we're fundamentally citizens of another nation, another kingdom, that we wouldn't fit into the current political sphere of this nation, no matter what it is. And so when I think of the public square, I think of real people. That's actually what the phrase used to mean. Today we use it metaphorically. It used to be the square in a town where people went to have real conversations. And now it's the place where we don't go to have fake conversations, right? So if what we mean is sitting down with people who differ than us and hashing these issues out with love and respect, even if we disagree on the solutions, then yes, we should do that. Christianity fundamentally, from the very beginning, has been a religion of truth, of grace, and of persuasion. It's not one of force. And so when I have a different perspective than someone that's informed by my Christian convictions, the Christian tradition would say I sit with them, I value them as a human person, and I reason with them. And I try to show them not just that something is right because the Bible says that should be enough, but because what God says is actually good for us. That a just biblical ordering of society is not just in accord with God's, template and his law, it's actually meant for our flourishing. And that's what government is actually about. It's about peace and flourishing. So I should engage in the public square because I love my neighbor and I want to honor my God with how he intends for us all to work and live and love each other together. So yes, we should be engaged, but we need to actually be Christians when we do it. If that makes sense.
That makes total sense. And I think as we move towards the general election, what I see is I feel like I see on Facebook or Twitter the venom, even among Christians, like gets more and more intense. And I feel like that in some ways that denies what you're talking about of seeing our citizenship in another kingdom or another place, and instead we're putting trust and confidence into a political party or a politician instead of into God or into Christ. And I feel like that it's just in a smaller way. It's kind of like how we in the South deal with stuff on Saturdays during football season. That we get our identity from a team or from a university, and in the same way, if I see that a state won and it's a victory for red, and I identify with that, then I feel like that's my victory and my team has won. When a lot of this stuff of what we see, I feel like saddens God, because you said at the very beginning, the issue of life is that we treat people with dignity and respect, even in our comments, even in the way that we converse about certain things. So, do you find it? I know that we've talked about this offline before, but do you find it hard to have those one-on-one or small group conversations with people that differ from you? And do you find that there's any nudging on either side of, I know that you're not trying to pull someone to your side to kind of get the politician a win, but I think some of these can be discipleship issues at the very least.
Yeah, there's a lot there. It's probably worth saying I'm more comfortable talking about controversial things than most people.
Okay.
So my wife and I went on a tour of Europe several years ago, and most of the people on these kinds of tours are like old enough to be our parents or grandparents. Okay. And a couple days of small talk was enough for me. And then at dinner the next night, you all eat dinner together. We've got people from Australia and Italy and different parts of the world, Canada. And I was just like, what are the controversial topics in your country? Like, let's talk about things that are important. Because what are we not supposed to talk about today? Religion, money, and politics. Basically, the only things that are of most importance in life you can't talk about with people. And that just should not be the case. But the reason we don't talk about it is because we generally can't actually do it and keep our character.
Right.
So for me, I'm comfortable talking about those things because my identity is not in a party. It's not ultimately in the positions I hold. Like, I want to know what's true. I want to believe what's true, and I want to act truthfully and rightly. And so if someone can show me where I am misinformed, they've done me a favor. They haven't harmed me. And that's just so backwards from, I think, how many of us see it. But I also view it as my job to keep everyone calm. So in any conversation, if someone's upset, they're not listening. You're not going to change their mind if you're just lobbing grenades at them.
Right.
So I want to keep the other person calm. I want to ask a lot of questions. A book that's been very helpful for me has been Tactics by Greg Koukl.
Right.
I want to understand what they think. I don't want to assume. Like, if someone's a Democrat and they say they're a Democrat, that doesn't mean they're pro-abortion. That might be boggling to many people. I have a guy that I'm discipling. He said, I don't see how you can be a Democrat and a Christian. I'm like, well, what do you mean by that? That's a question. What do you mean by that, this guy I'm talking about? Do you mean that you can't be a registered Democrat? Does it mean you can't vote for any Democratic candidates? There are pro-life Democrats. Does it mean you can't actually be pro-choice and be a Christian? Like, which of those things do you mean? And have you even thought about the nuance that real people are not talking heads on TV? So I want to treat someone as a person, and I'm willing to be pushed on issues. I do have a perspective. I would love for people to agree with me. I generally think I'm right on the things I talk about, like everyone else. But my identity is not in those things.
Right.
And I've been blessed. We have a mutual friend, you knew when you were here, who we see some things very differently. And once or twice a week for about a year, we went and got Mexican food and just kind of lovingly debated and pushed each other. And I think both of our perspectives and values were different at the end of it. So be willing to have those conversations. But those are in-person conversations. They're generally not behind a keyboard, if that helps.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think it's wonderful because not only do you get to, you get asked more about not what you believe, but why, some of the behind. And sometimes that causes you to do some thinking and, you may end up answering that, well, that's what my parents always voted, or whatever the case may be.
I wanted to clarify one thing. So I am not at all concerned in campaigning for a politician or a person. You're not going to find me doing that. Hopefully, accountability moment here. I am much more concerned with issues and how we structure our society. My church right now, we're preaching through 1 Corinthians, and it's so interesting to me that Paul is calling the church at Corinth on the carpet for so many things, but they're dividing over who the good teachers are, and they're actually good teachers.
Right.
And he's calling them out for dividing over the people who are helpful to them, who are actually on God's side. And today, I don't think most of our politicians are on God's side. It's just my perspective. But we divide over them in a way that is shameful, that Paul would have upped the ante for 10x, even in the church. Like that some people will say, I can't sit next to someone in church, or I can't go to the same church, I feel unsafe with someone, or I can't believe that they're a Christian on whatever issue. Like, we have let worldly things that are temporary and passing away, to quote Paul, divide us in the body of Christ, which is eternal.
Right.
And that's just lamentable. And so I should be willing to not put a bumper sticker on my car, not campaign for someone, not wear a hat or whatever, if it means that the gospel of Christ is not tarnished, if it means that I've got an opportunity and a conversation that I wouldn't have had. So I think another helpful question for us is, when people look at my social media feed, when they look at what I talk about, do they think I'm more concerned with politics today? Is Donald Trump my king? Is Bernie my king? Or is Jesus my king? And we would all say, no human person outside of the incarnate Jesus Christ is my king. But how do we act? Like, do our actions and our words betray us? I think often they do.
I would agree with that. And it's sad because there's like real anecdotal stories that I have of people who've driven up, come into our church, left our church, and it's not just here in Gainesville, but even in Tallahassee, and because of certain bumper stickers on cars. And it kind of goes back to almost your other guy's question of saying, like, well, how can they vote for that person and be a Christian? I can't worship in the same place as that person. So all right, I want to remind you, if you're tuning in, we got 13 people watching. If you have questions for Brian, go ahead and put those in the comments. They'll be linked over here to the computer that I'm going off of and going down our list. But here's another one that I feel like I used to know how to do this several years ago, and I don't know how to do it anymore. But what's the best way to hold our politicians accountable? Because the line is they're going to promise everything up until they get elected, and then they're going to do whatever they want. But especially if you have candidates, and I'll speak to just maybe this way to narrow the question down. If you have candidates that run and they tout Christianity as being part of who they are as a politician, but then they either don't follow through or they begin lobbying for or voting for things that are strictly outside of what we would say is biblical Christianity, how would we go about holding them accountable in this republic that we have?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Let me start from the end there a little. This takes us back to our triage question. In other words, how do we understand what's important and what's not? So there are people who hold a very firmly pro-life conviction that may think there are vastly different means to accomplishing that than I do. And so I don't get the ability to say you're not pro-life because you would try to solve this issue a different way than I do. Right? I don't get to judge their heart. We disagree on methods. Methods matter. Okay, but if we agree on the first thing, like that's different. And I think many of us today say your approach looks different than mine, therefore it's not biblical, therefore you're not a Christian or whatever. There's much more nuance there. But with regards to politicians, we have to realize we live in a fallen world. I think that's part of it. And there will be no perfect law. There will be probably no politician who's able to do everything just as they would want based on the principles they pull out of the scriptures. I think it's incredibly difficult to be someone who wants to be convictional and Christian today and be in politics. So those people need our prayer. I think they need some of our understanding. It's very easy to sit back and say, I would never do that, and not be privy to the constraints that are foisted upon the leaders of our nation. But in terms of holding people accountable, how you vote, I know that sounds trite. I used to be pro-life, but I thought like, what's going to happen is going to happen. And so I didn't register to vote. I wasn't involved in politics. And I actually realized like it actually does really matter. So I'm going to be informed. I'm going to vote. I'm going to, I'm not going to say campaign because that has a context. I'm going to contend for my beliefs from the scriptures winsomely, kindly, with grace with people, because these things are important. And so it does matter that we call balls and strikes with our politicians. So there are people today that have like anti-Trump derangement syndrome. Okay. And if he does something that anyone else would have done and they would have thought it was good, that they'll find a way to critique it. And then there are people that will find no wrong in him.
Right.
I don't want to be that person. I want to be the person who calls balls and strikes, and it isn't so much about the person, it's what they're doing and the effects they're having on society. So voting, I think, is one. I really do think prayer as a first order principle, because ultimately, and this goes back to what we said earlier, it's God that will hold people accountable.
Right.
So yes, we should strive for justice in this life, but we always need to realize it will be imperfect justice. And so God is the one who judges justly and will set all things right. Having conversations, this takes us back to the public square conversation. So if I can contend for my belief and change someone's mind, and they vote differently on an issue, on a person, that's a way of holding someone accountable. There may be other people who have given more thought to this, but that's how I would answer it.
Yeah. Well, and I know that every single one of our politicians has emails. They have phone, that you can call in. Some people think it's, I don't know how to make this change, but, when you find out that a politician is doing something, especially somebody that's in your district or in your region or wherever the case may be, you can make, those emails go straight to them, and they have somebody there that's usually like taking tally of like, oh, we've gotten this many, no's, or they don't want you to go this way, or whatever the case may be. So.
Right. Yeah, I intended to say that. I'm glad you brought that up. And I think they actually have to read all of that.
Right.
It's not optional. I have a friend who works in a senator's office. So
okay.
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
Okay. All right. We have a question from one of our students named Bo. He asked this question: from a Christian viewpoint, how should we view the conflict between Israel and Palestine?
Yeah. So I'm going to start out acknowledging what most of us should probably acknowledge on this. Like, I am ill-informed and ill-equipped to understand the nuance here. But I think this is another example where we have to call balls and strikes. So there's a certain way of understanding the scriptures and God's promises to Israel that would lead someone to say Israel does no wrong today. And I don't think that's legitimate. So I do think Israel, like every nation, does things that are unjust. I think there's specific actions we can point to. I also think we can point to the xenophobic rhetoric that often seems to come out of Palestine, where certain people want to annihilate Israel and the Jews. Like, let's be very clear on that being anti-life, but let's also be clear when the other side seems to be anti-life. I have views on Israel that I don't know that we want to get into today. Like, as a promise that God has made to his people, I do think there's something for ethnic Israel. What that looks like and how that works out when Jesus comes back and those promises, I honestly don't know. So Israel has been a helpful partner to us as a nation. But once again, we don't want to excuse injustice just because someone does things that are helpful to us.
Right.
So that's probably as far as I'm willing to go on that question.
Yeah, and I'm not gonna. I'll tell a story. I haven't like you just not done a lot of research, but when I was in Tallahassee, we had a student who was in the ROTC program at FSU, and over the course of the summer, he and another one of the guys that was at our church went to the Middle East to kind of do a semester abroad and study Arabic. And while they were there, they were in classes with lots of Muslims that were in the same school where they were at, and they learned more about. I don't want to use the wrong term here, but they learned a lot more than we were getting any kind of information back here in the United States. Just as far as some of the things that persecution that Israel was putting onto Muslims, and as a person who believes highly in religious freedom and religious liberty, and to see kind of that state in some ways oppress people who, again, like we talked about earlier, are made in the image of God, and to see, quote unquote God's people doing that to these other folks. He just came back and he actually wrote a big position paper at the end of his. He was a political science major there, and it got him stirring and thinking. And it was neat for me to see him as a young man who got that exposure, was going into our military, still is in the United States Army, to have that experience and understand that there are people that are made in the image of God. And a lot of times what we see, if we're only allowing news and things that are sensationalized to be what impact and influence our lives, we're only getting a stereotype of a person and an individual. So that's a great question, Bo. We need the questions to keep coming. All right, I would like to kind of ask you to help us think through immigration. Immigration has been something that has been big over the last couple years, and I know with everything that's going on right now, we could see some more dramatic changes take place after this. I mean, we've cut down international travel and those type of things, but how should we as Christians think about immigration? I think that, I don't know the exact word used in Scripture, but I see that we are nomads in certain places, that we are people that are aliens in certain places, that this is not our home. In the Old Testament, I believe that Israel was commanded to treat people in a certain way if they were not part of the people of Israel. But how are you doing it, thinking through this? This is something that's probably another can of worms.
Yeah, I mean, so I pulled up some passages here before we started talking today, but Philippians 3:20, our citizenship is in heaven. I think that's really important for us to remember, that we are aliens and strangers here, that we are fundamentally citizens of another kingdom, and we're actually sent to this one, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians, with a message of reconciliation. Like, we're the ambassadors in this nation. So this nation should never be primary in our thinking. The kingdom of heaven should. Now, what that looks like, how we work that out, I've got areas there I've got to improve on, but we have to start from that agreement. So with regards to immigration, once again, we need to start from what is the Scripture directly clear about, straight line issue versus jagged issue. So for instance, is government even something instituted by God, and what's a government? And the answer is yes. So you have Romans 13. The government's purpose is to punish wrongdoers and praise good. We get that in First Peter 2. Well, you only can do that if there are laws, and if there is an ordering of society where some people have authority and others don't. You can also only do that if there is a group of people that is known and a land over which is being ruled. In order to have that, you have to have a border. Okay, so people who want to say the Bible is anti-border, that doesn't make sense. You can't have a nation without a border. Now, who do we let in, and under what circumstances? That's a very good question. But I go back to Romans 13. It talks about the fact that God has given us government as a servant for our well-being, that we need to follow the rule of government. It's actually all throughout the New Testament. It's all throughout the Old Testament. So if our nation has said, you can only cross the border in X way, then Christians should not be in favor of people crossing the border in a different way. If what that means is we're in favor of them breaking the law, what we should say is, are the qualifications for who can come in and out legally just? And if they're not, let's address that from changing the law. We should never be in favor of encouraging people to break the law.
Right.
I think that's really important. Okay, so we can debate the justness of a law, but we should always be pro laws being followed as long as they are not inherently unjust. And it's not inherently unjust to say people can't come into your nation, all things equal. That's important.
Right.
So I think we should be very grieved by the treatment of people who come into this country illegally. They are often exploited by our citizens or by our government. You don't get to exploit someone just because they came into a country illegally, like that. But they don't surrender their right to being treated like a valuable person. We should also be deeply grieved by how people are held in containment. And I think of, I know people want to say, well, this president or that president, sure, whatever. Who's accountable? It's always a very complicated question when you're talking about government. However, we should care about what is happening to people today. And people being trapped in cages in their own excrement is something no one should be subjected to. I also think we need to say that this country is fundamentally a land that views all people, at least it used to, as valuable people created by a creator. And so if there are people fleeing their country from persecution, especially religious persecution, isn't that why America got started?
Right.
Pretty much. So why would we say, well, that's good for us, we're here, but no, I'm sorry, I'm not willing to help you. That doesn't make sense. I think often there is a sense of fear of people who are different, or fear that this will infringe upon my way of life, that's behind certain people's views on immigration. And that would make sense, right, if this nation is all there is, and if our king is the president. But if our king is Jesus and we're a stranger here, then I should want people to be safe, be able to have religious freedom. I should want people to I should want people to be able to have the opportunities I have.
Makes sense.
Now, how do you do that in a wise way? Because what you might say is, well, you should let everyone in. Well, that might not actually be the wisest thing. That might lead to everyone being worse off. And so how we work those principles out is kind of above my pay grade.
Right.
But we have to have grace with each other.
Right.
And once again, if we treat people as valuable image bearers of God, they don't cease to be that because they're not in our country. They don't cease to be that because they broke a lot of come here. I do think we need to care about families getting separated. I do think we need to care about people who the government has known have been here for 30 years and just decided to deport today. And there seems to be an act of injustice in that to me.
Right.
So those are some of the ways that I kind of work through that issue.
That's great. All right, here we got a question from Kat. Continue to bring those questions in. We got about 15 more minutes. Kat asks, most people would agree that our news is pretty partisan. Do you have suggestions on reliable, nonpartisan as possible sources where people can find their news?
That's a really good question. I'm going to admit frustration here along with you. I often don't know if what I'm reading is accurate.
Okay.
Now, everyone has a bias, okay? Not all biases are inappropriate. I have a bias in favor of Christianity. Christianity is true. That's an appropriate bias. The question is it an illegitimate bias? Is it a distorting bias? Those are the things we need to work through. It does seem to me like the news is increasingly polarized, right? So you have conservative sources who will say nothing bad about Donald Trump, even when he does things that are distinctly not conservative. Okay, and you have liberal sources that can't admit when he does something that is good. They just have to find fault with it. We should not be like that. That goes back to a constant thread through what I've been saying. My home is not in a party. I'm going to call balls and strikes. I think one thing to do is read widely. That requires more work on your part. But read the same story from 4 sources. See what the BBC says. See what Al Jazeera says.
That's what I do.
And try to kind of piece it together and still hold that perspective with somewhat of an open hand and realize that perhaps everything both sides of the aisle said is true, right? Like there's much more nuance out there than we often think. Things are much more gray in terms of is someone right or wrong than we want to say. So it's very possible that Fox pulls out the truthful parts that agree with them and that's all they said, and CNN pulls out the truthful parts that are bad, and that's all they say, and both of those are an inaccurate, deceitful picture.
Right.
So you've got to do more work than just say what's fed to me on a plate, and that requires reading, I think, more broadly.
Makes sense. And don't be stupid. Like if it sounds too good to be true, or if it sounds so sensationalized, like if you spell, I can remember there were emails going around. If you spell President Obama's name in all these different ways, he's like somebody that's part of the Taliban, or he's the Antichrist, or whatever the case may be. Well, that's probably not true. So.
Yeah. Well, and that's a really good point. Like I wish the person in the White House conducted themselves with the civility and grace and respect that Obama had.
Right.
Like the way he treated his wife, the way he treated other people, at least publicly, the way he seemed to esteem and respect the huge honor and also weight that he had. That set a really good example, and we don't have that today.
Right.
So I can say that and disagree with his policies on things, and say I really appreciated how he comported himself as a human being.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let me ask this question. So you spoke briefly about kind of the biblical view of the death penalty. How would you, because I've heard this before, how would you say, well, I agree with the death penalty, yet you're agreeing to kill people, and that is in some way, shape, or form showing that you have value for a life? It seems like it's a contradiction, but I think you can flesh that out so that maybe people will understand it's not necessarily as contradictory as it may sound.
Yeah. So one thing we have to say is, why should we even consider being in favor of the death penalty? And it's not enough to say it's the law of the land. It's not enough to say my parents were. For me, the reason why I am in favor of the death penalty as a type of punishment, and we can talk about its application in a minute, is because God instituted the death penalty. This was pre the Mosaic law. This is Genesis 9. So God says, whoever sheds human blood by other humans, his blood must be shed. There's a reason for this. It says, for in God's image, God has made humankind. So it is because we are created according to the image of God, that God has put his seal on us, that we have a status that gives us worth, that no one has the right to unjustly take another person's life. Okay, so what we can't say is you can't ever kill someone because they're made in the image of God, because that would make God a liar here. Because God's the one telling us to do it. The question is, in what circumstances and what type of body or group has that authority? And throughout the scriptures, we see that this is an authority that's given to government. So when Romans 13 talks about governments not bearing the sword in vain, it says it doesn't say they don't bear the quill in vain, it says they don't bear the sword in vain. In other words, God is using them as an instrument of justice. And in fact, you can't have laws without a sword behind it. Or what is that? That's a mockery. If there's no force to actually enforce a law that's made, then injustice will reign. It's only through the use of force that peace, at least on this side of Genesis 3 in this fallen world, is kept. So I'm going to be for the death penalty, in theory at least, because God is. And so hopefully that answers your question, if I'm reviewing this question correctly. It's not just that I get to decide. In fact, I am not allowed as an individual to decide to take another person's life. So right before Romans 13 and talking about the state, you have Romans 12 talking about the individual, and it says, don't get vengeance for yourself, right? Repay evil with kindness, and in this way heap burning coals on their head. So that's me as an individual. Now, the authority and hence responsibility God has given to the government is different than that. I'm not responsible for enacting justice. The government is. And so that's why they are able, and I wouldn't just say able, I would say they are required to institute the death penalty and institute it justly. Now, where I'm going to diverge from where we are today is, I don't think the administration of the death penalty, I don't think the criminal justice system in general is just. I think people are jailed for things that they should never be jailed for. I think sentences are too long for some things. I think sentences for other things aren't long enough. Like, consider, in the Old Testament, rape is a capital crime. God takes rape more seriously than we do today,
right,
in many ways. So there are those sorts of things where we diverge from things that I think are pretty clear. And I talked earlier, for those who aren't here, about the racial disparities in the administration of the death penalty, about the class differences, which is perhaps a greater difference. Like, you should not be more likely to be killed for the same crime just because you have less money than someone else.
right.
That's a failing on our government and our system. And if we're going to take someone's life and claim it's just, we need to apply an equal standard of justice regardless of how much it costs us.
That makes sense.
So.
All right, last question. Then we can let you share some resources. I got a resource. But I thought this is a good question. You know, I assume that y'all in Leon County are under some kind of stay-at-home order. We're in a stay-at-home order. I consider myself to be in the order that was given in Alachua County right now, a minimum basic operations person here at our church. The only employees in our office right now are me and one of our other staff that are helping to pull this off. But asking this question, are there laws that Christians can be okay breaking? And they cited, jaywalking, speeding. I would say that hits me as a conviction right now. I learned a hard lesson the night after Christmas this past year. because I thought I was in one speed zone and I wasn't. And $250 later and 4 hours on a basic driving course, I was reminded that the state has the sword, also has the pen for writing tickets and citations. But what do you think?
If you don't pay that ticket, right, the sword will come out.
Yeah, eventually.
Definitely.
Yes, some point in time.
Yeah.
So
what do I think about that?
Yeah, because I could think, like, I know that even for college students, like when I was in college, Napster was a thing. People don't even know what that is, but it was like this music sharing type thing. Now I would say it would be like torrent sites where you can stream stuff that's coming out in the movie theaters and doing that all illegally. And, you know, people saying, well, it's not that big of a deal, but it is a big deal.
Right. Yeah, so this whole category of perhaps what we might call victimless crimes, should we care about that? And the answer is yes. So there are people today who want to say, well, it shouldn't be a crime, there shouldn't be a punishment if there's not a victim. The Bible just doesn't weigh that out the same way. We don't get to decide which laws we follow. If we say the government is actually ordained by God to do what it does, then I have an obligation to follow what it says. And the victim, at the very least in a victimless crime, is my soul.
Right.
Because by transgressing a law, even if I don't agree with it, I have sinned. Right? We have to say, like, those victimless crimes are sins for which Jesus had to die. So I don't want to, like, Jesus juke everyone, but it actually really does matter. And often what we don't think is a victimless crime, what we think is a victimless crime, often is not a victimless crime. So a lot of artists out there, things like recording artists, it's hard to be an artist, especially in the days of Spotify and all those type of sites. They get paid a lot less for their music. And so I think, well, I'm not hurting anyone because I torrented this music or this video, but you're actually stealing from someone. And stealing breaks one of the 10 commandments. This doesn't just affect your soul, it actually takes money that rightly belongs to someone else. It harms the economy. Like, there's an aggregate from theft that harms our economy. I think of speeding, right? You might say, well, it's a victimless crime. Well, it's only a victimless crime because while you were more likely to cause an accident, you happened not to. And you might say, I'm comfortable navigating at 20 miles over the speed limit, but does that mean everyone else on the road is comfortable in those same circumstances navigating around you at 20 miles over the speed limit? No, it doesn't mean that. It puts us in the seat of being judged, which is not a seat that God has put us in. Right. There's a lot more that could be said than that. We could talk about the fact that some people would say that laws that aren't enforced or enforced a certain way become their own kind of de facto law. I think that gets murky once again. And I also think it matters that we understand what the actual law is. So there are lots of different ways shelter in place is actually instituted across the United States. So, you know, that might mean I'm allowed to go to fill up my gas tank, go to Publix, pick up some takeout, and come home. I mean, that feels a little normal to me. But it might also mean I'm not allowed to be out in a group of 3 sitting around. And if that's what it means, I should care about that, because that law is in place to protect other people's health. And I think the last thing I'll leave you with, I think this was Kant, who said, Immanuel Kant, behave in such a way as you wish everyone else would also. Mm-hmm. In other words, do you wish everyone would disregard the speed limit? Well, no. Like, so why should I? Right? If everyone acted the way I think I should, I would say that bad things are going to happen, so I shouldn't do it either. Those are probably a few ways to look at that question.
That makes sense. I love the fact that you brought in, and like I said, it steps on my toes when I think about how I've rationalized or justified the reasons for breaking those laws. You know, at the end of the day, it's because at some point in time, it's my heart level idolatry of myself that I want to have that for me, not thinking about other people. So, all right, real quick, I know you got some resources, so share some resources, and then we'll call it a day.
Yeah. So I think you've got Bruce Ashford's book, There Are Letters to an American Christian, or something like that.
I do.
That's a good book. Very helpful. Not as much Bible in it, but it's also not meant to be that kind of book. It's kind of the style of book that's like it's letters written to someone. Right. There's also a book, and forgive me if there are objectionable things in it, but Letters to a Young Progressive. That's not written from a Christian standpoint, but it's helpful at teasing out some of the dynamics that are behind the conversation today around these issues to show there's more nuance on both sides.
Gotcha.
How the Nations Rage, going off of Psalm 2, Jonathan Leeman, very helpful book in so many ways. Like, he's going to build a framework for how we should think about government. It's accessible. It's not stuffy or academic, but we often think, this is one of my biggest takeaways from the book, which is helpful. We often think, oh, well, Christians, we shouldn't bring our convictions into politics. We need to be neutral. No one else is neutral.
Right.
There is no neutral viewpoint on anything since God is king. And the non-Christians, they're bringing their convictions, religious and otherwise, into the public square. So how do we think through that? And so a lot of the questions and things we talked about today, that book is going to go more in depth on. I think it's very helpful.
Plug your podcast and where we can get your book.
Yeah. So unapologeticpodcast.com, or you can just go to brianseagraves.com. I do a podcast. It's turned out to be about every other week now, but I've done it almost every week for about 5 years or so, on questions around Christianity, like why should we trust the Bible? How do we think about the death penalty? What are the good reasons to believe that Jesus rose from the dead? So it's on those kind of questions. It's almost always about 14 minutes long. So I hope that would be helpful to you. 2 books, Gender, a Conversation Guide. It's very short. If you're interested in thinking through this idea of gender and what does the Bible have to say about it, and how do I talk to my friends, might be helpful. And then Unapologetic, a Guide for Defending Your Christian Convictions, is kind of like a one-stop shop for how do I answer the most difficult questions about Christianity, from people who say, well, that's true for you and not for me, people who say, well, the resurrection was just explained by hallucinations, to what do we do with abortion and homosexuality? Like, how should we think through those topics as Christians? So everything from foundational worldview stuff to cultural engagement. Awesome.
Hey, thanks so much for your time. I know that it was beneficial for me, for our students. If you're tuning in late or you see this later on, we want to thank Brian for his time with being with us today. And then we're gonna post this online. I'll try and link you a copy too if you need it for some of your resources. But you're amazing. I appreciate your friendship and hope you and the family stay safe.
Thanks, man.
All right.
Talk to you later.
See you.